Only joking. No, this is a good introduction of a lot of information. There's a lot of information, so I'll go through.
Sorry. And do you know what the next webinar is? Because that's one of your tasks.
Yes, I do. Yeah, no. I'm right across it. Right across it. Right across it. And it's a webinar where we do dud out. It's at 1 a.m. our time, so I don't think there'll be many attending that one from Australia. But the good thing about these webinars is that they are recorded so that we can view them at our leisure. So it's 8:01. And we don't have a whole lot of people here yet.
Well, we've got 26 people. I think 26 is, I mean.
Oh, okay. I can only see good. Us. I thought we were just in our. Right. Okay, that's great. Well, then let's kick off. Are we live then?
We're live. We're live.
Oh, you're fantastic. Live and you're being recorded.
Oh, wonderful. Fantastic. Well, with no further ado, welcome everyone, all 26 and more. We're expecting more people to this AFINet webinar. My name is Rob Campbell and I'm one of the trustees of AFINet. So AFINet, which for those who don't know, stands for Addiction and the Family International Network, and exists to bring together practitioners, researchers, policymakers and experts by experience who are all interested or involved in the effects that someone's problematic use of alcohol or other drugs or gambling has on other members of their family and on other people close to them. We have more than 850 members from 58 countries across the world, and that number is growing. You can learn more about AFINet from our website, and if you are not already a member, please consider joining. It's free, and you can do that by completing the application form, which is on the AFINet website. Among the things that AFINet does are our conferences and our webinar series, of which this is an important part. In alternate years, we hold either a face-to-face conference or an online one. The last one was in May this year, a face-to-face conference in the lovely and interesting city of Quebec in Canada, which was an amazing success, and I had the privilege of presenting there as well. The next will be online, and that will be in 2026 on the 17th of September and the 18th of September. And because we make this an international conference and it's online, on the 17th, we're going to be focusing on time zones that suit the Americas, so North and South America and Western Europe. And then on the 18th of September, which is a Friday, it will focus time zones more conducive to those in Southeast Asia, Australasia, and Eastern Europe as well. So a call for abstracts will be out shortly, and keep an eagle eye for that, because it's a really exciting opportunity to share what's happening in your area of research and work. So keep an eye out for that. And again, that's on our AFINet website. The programs and the recordings of all the conference presentations going back to our online conference in 2021 are all on our website. The webinar that you are going to hear about today is part of our webinar series. The webinars are free, but as a small charity with no funding sources whatsoever, donations from those who attend the webinars are always welcome. Again, details of how to donate are on the website. And the technical side of these webinars, running the video conferencing systems and making the recordings and so on, are undertaken by two of our colleagues in Finland who work for the A-Clinic Foundation, Sari Juvansuu and Jana Takala. So a huge thank you to them. And apologies for my pronunciation. I hope that was a Finnish approximation. The webinar series has been running since October 2020. And like the conferences, all of the presentations are also online on our website. So people who want to catch up on the wide range of excellent and fascinating presentations we've had from all over the world, from Australia and New Zealand through Indonesia and Malaysia, through many European countries, and from Canada, USA and Brazil and counting. Today's webinar comes from Australia, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Cathie Tulloch. Cathie is a senior postdoctoral research fellow at CQ University's Experimental Gambling Research Laboratory in Australia, based in Sydney. She specialises in understanding and quantifying the impacts of gambling-related harm. Cathie completed her PhD in 2023 with her doctoral research focusing specifically on the health and wellbeing harms experienced by the family and friends of people who gamble. Her broader research experience includes contributing to large-scale projects, estimating the social and economic costs of gambling to communities in Australia and New Zealand. An experienced quantitative researcher, Cathie has a strong background in survey design, data analysis, and economic costing. Before her academic career, she had an extensive background in private sector business management, has been a volunteer suicide crisis supporter with Lifeline Australia for over 10 years, bringing a unique real-world perspective to her work. Today, she's going to talk about the core findings from her research into the impacts of gambling harm on affected others, the family, friends, and partners of those who gamble. She'll be sharing insights from a large-scale Australian study that helps identify who is most at risk and why. So in order to hear Cathie's story, what we're going to be doing is Cathie will present for 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for people to ask questions and for us to have a discussion based on the exciting research that Cathie's going to present to us. As the talk progresses, please write any questions in the chat function in Teams, and Cathie will answer them at the end, which I'll facilitate those questions. Or at the end, simply put up your hand using the hand function on Teams. And if that doesn't work and you're not sure how to use that, just get my attention at the end when I ask for questions. So, Cathie, with no further ado, we welcome you to present your paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm happy to be here today. Let me just share my presentation. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Yes, good, fantastic. So thank you. Before I start, in Australia, we like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. So I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm presenting from today in Sydney, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So today I'm going to be presenting some work that I did a couple of years ago in my PhD. Mainly I'll be discussing the results of a large-scale study of over 1,000 people in New South Wales who've been impacted by the gambling of someone close to them. Someone's taken control of my presentation. Right, okay. I'll begin by briefly outlining sort of the context of gambling harm for affected others, and including some important sort of prior research, which will give sort of more context. Then I'll describe the study's sort of aims and methodology, and the main focus will be on our sort of key findings, which I've split into two parts. First, who's most likely to be harmed, and second, what behaviours and resources might influence that experience. I'll finish by discussing the implications of this work, and there should be time for questions at the end. And excuse my voice, I've got a bit of a cold, so I'll try and keep it going. So to understand the context of our work, it's important to grasp the scale of gambling in Australia. Australians lose more money to gambling per person than any other nation on earth, making it a significant public health issue. And sort of nowhere is this issue more concentrated than our largest state, New South Wales, which is where I live. So New South Wales is home to nearly half the country's poker machines, or pokies, or slots, as you might know them. And these machines are located in many venues across the state, including clubs and pubs in most suburbs. So to give you an idea of the scale, there are 13 pubs and a couple of clubs in the suburb in which I live, all of which have pokies. So they're really accessible. You really find them everywhere. And they've been consistently shown to be a form of gambling really strongly associated with gambling problems. So a recent study we did showed that more than half the gambling problems in Australia were due to pokies or slot machines. And the harm experienced by the person who gambles then creates this ripple effect through to the people around them. So it's been estimated that for people with severe gambling problems, around 6 people are negatively impacted. In the latest New South Wales prevalence study, about 12.7 or 12.8% of the adult population reported being harmed by someone else's gambling within the previous 12 months. So it's around 1 in 8 adults in the community, which is more than the 1 in 12 people who sort of experience harm from their own gambling. And these affected others are quite a broad category of people, covering many different relationships to the person who gambles. So from spouses and other family members through to friends and work colleagues. And the harm experienced from this other person's gambling can then extend through all areas of their lives. So financial, relationship issues, work study issues. And I guess the ultimate impact of experiencing this harm is the impact it has on that person's health and well-being. And this is what I examined in my PhD. And it provides some background to the study I'll be talking about today. So I'll very briefly describe this work now. So my PhD examined the impact of gambling problems on the health and well-being of affected others, and addressed several important gaps of knowledge around affected others. So at that time, previous research was predominantly based on sort of interviews with female partners of people seeking treatment for gambling problems. Particularly in Australia, and there was some key issues with this. I guess firstly, and most importantly, most people with gambling problems don't seek treatment. So these affected others represented only a really sort of small proportion of those impacted, the ones whose partners were accessing sort of professional help. And additionally, harm's obviously not limited to only female partners. It can extend across a wide range of relationships to the person who gambles, and it's obviously not specific to just one gender. Another thing was that although affected others tended to report health and well-being problems, these studies were cross-sectional, so we didn't really understand what came first or what the sort of real impact of gambling was. So while it was definitely clear that affected others were negatively impacted by gambling problems, when I did my PhD, there wasn't much sort of solid population level evidence to back it all up and to give us an idea of sort of really how severe the problem is. So I used large representative population studies to examine the experience of affected others in the Australian community. So I used data sets like HILDA, the household income and labour data set, and LASAC, which is a children's one that follows children from birth through to, I think they're about 23 now. One of the studies I did identified that financial well-being is negatively impacted for people exposed across the entire range of gambling problem severity. So even people close to someone with a relatively mild gambling problem were financially impacted. But on the other hand, the bulk of the health and wellbeing issues we saw in affected others were primarily associated with those exposed to more severe gambling problems. But I wanted to also understand whether living with a person with a gambling problem sort of directly causes the harm to the family members, and if so, what type of harm, or were there other sort of factors at play? So we looked at 18 years of data from nearly 14,000 people in Australia, and we identified people living with a person with a relatively severe gambling problem, so living in the same household. And then we looked back in time at their wellbeing, so back over the previous 18 years. And the assumption we made was that the gambling would probably not have been a problem for the entire sort of 18 years. Tends to be more short-lived, or the people are no longer sort of in that household. And we've had two really clear patterns of harm. First, there was a sort of clear direct link between a gambling problem and a decline in financial and social well-being. So when there was someone in the household with a gambling problem, other members of the household satisfaction with their finances sort of stalled, and their social lives suffered. And by this I mean they felt they had less support from others, and they felt sort of less connected to their communities. And there was quite a clear link between the gambling problems and these financial and social wellbeing impacts. And this is sort of the first longitudinal study to sort of look at this in a community setting. But second, interestingly, for other things like general health, psychological health, life satisfaction, we saw quite a different pattern. The family members had lower wellbeing in these areas across the entire 18-year period. So not just the period when we believed that the gambling problem was happening, but the entire 18 years. So this sort of suggested to us that while gambling sort of directly damages the household finances and the social connections of the affected others, other issues like the poorer health might be sort of pre-existing challenges that make the household members more vulnerable to gambling problems in the first place. And the harm experienced directly from gambling then would increase or exacerbate these issues. So, excuse me for a second. So moving on to the study I'll be talking about today, we had several key objectives. First, we want to understand who is most at risk of harm from someone else's gambling. Is it partners or family or friends? And we wanted to understand whether the closeness of this relationship matters more than the official relationship type. We also want to understand the specific health and wellbeing impacts that were associated with that harm. Then the second key aim was to understand the role of the individual's actions, so their coping styles and the resources like social support in either protecting them from or exposing them to sort of more harm and distress. So to answer our questions, we conducted a large survey with over 1,100 affected others from New South Wales. And this was not treatment related, so this was just a community-based panel survey, which gave us sort of a broad picture of the issue. Again, we chose New South Wales because, well, that's where the funder was based, but also, as I discussed earlier, the high concentration of the high harm products means that if you want to sort of understand community impacts of gambling, New South Wales does provide a quite an appropriate setting. So the study used a range of sort of validated tools to measure not only the harm they're experiencing, but details about their relationships, health, coping strategies, levels of social support. And we also developed a measure of relationship closeness, which we called the significant other closeness scale. And so we did this because one of the sort of key challenges we faced and a sort of gap we saw was how to properly measure sort of the closeness of the relationship. So almost all the previous research in this area just categorises people by their sort of relationship type, a partner, a family member, a friend, and so on. But this can be a sort of quite a blunt instrument. As we know from our own lives, a sibling or a friend can describe many sort of different relationships. You could have a friend you see once a month, or a friend who's also your housemate and whom you share bills with. You could have a sibling who lives, in another state or another country with little day-to-day contact, or one who you share responsibility for looking after aged parents. So the potential for harm we sort of hypothesised was different depending on sort of how close they were sort of practically and financially. And we thought that might matter more than the official sort of relationship label. But to test this, we couldn't use existing measures. There were some measures out that measured sort of emotional connections or emotional closeness, but nothing that had these sort of different aspects. So we've developed this sort of novel measure, especially for the study, the significant other closeness scale. It was the first time anyone sort of tried to differentiate relationships in this way. And we didn't want to build it just about emotional closeness. So based on sort of the existing harm framework, we decided to measure it sort of across 4 key domains of connection. So the emotional closeness, so how important they are to each other, whether they think about the other person a lot, whether they disclose personal information, that sort of stuff. The financial connectedness, do they have shared bills, shared dependencies, shared day-to-day responsibilities, so parenting responsibilities, household duty, there could be work, anything that's sort of tied up, and just time spent together. And this new scale sort of allowed us to differentiate between relationships and move beyond sort of who they are to how close their lives are. So whether it's a friend with shared financial responsibilities. And this turned out to be quite important for understanding who gets harmed and why. So what did we find? Our first aim was to examine who is most affected by another person's gambling problem and in what way. So to participate in a study, the people were required to report being close to someone that they felt had had problems with their gambling within the past 12 months. So, and we left it at that. It was quite an open question, leaving it up to the participant to define what problems with gambling sort of meant to them. And all those people were then defined as affected others. The vast majority, this was 92.5%, reported experiencing one or more harms from that person's gambling. and 70% reported more than 4 different harms. Which you found interesting because it indicates just by asking someone in the community if they're close to someone with a gambling problem, if they say yes, there's a very strong likelihood that they themselves will be experiencing harm, from this gambling. So then we looked at who is most at risk of experiencing this harm. And harm was measured by the GHS 20AO, which is a validated 20-item sort of harm measure. And we found that the type of relationship you have with the person who gambles does make a significant difference. For example, ex-partners and current partners reported significantly higher levels of harm than family members and non-family members. Overall, ex-partners reported the highest levels of harm, significantly more even than current partners. And it's quite interesting, and it's consistent with other more recent national research in Australia. And as we discuss later, it's like, leaving the relationship doesn't necessarily mean leaving the problem behind. Next came current partners, then family members, then non-family members. For family members, the males reported higher mean harm scores than female affected others, but there were no other gender differences we found across the relationship types. Then we looked at why certain relationships might be more susceptible for harm. The first thing we found is that closeness does matter, but only for some groups. So this picture, I'll sort of talk you through it, shows a correlation between the perceived closeness of the relationship between the affected other and the person who gambles, and the harm they experience from that person's gambling. So for partners and ex-partners, the white shading is indicating that there's no significant relationship between harm and the perceived closeness, which basically means that the partners and ex-partners are likely to experience high harm no matter how close they report being to the person who gambles. But for other family members and non-family relationships, the closeness of the relationship makes a really big difference. You can see this by sort of the high correlations in red. So if other family members and non-family members have shared financial and other responsibilities, then they're likely to experience harm. The others are much less likely to experience harm. This helps us understand why some friends or colleagues are deeply affected, while others might not be. And interestingly, we found that it wasn't about the emotional connection. The key factors impacting harm were more that practical interdependence. So shared finances, sharing day-to-day responsibilities were the factors most strongly associated with experiencing harm, which sort of suggests that caring for someone with a gambling problem or being emotionally close doesn't automatically lead to harm. It's the practical shared aspects of life that sort of create that vulnerability. And I suspect that it might be possible for people close to someone with a gambling problem to continue to sort of provide that emotional support while potentially withdrawing in some other ways to protect themselves. It'd be great to sort of understand more about that. We then looked at what this harm actually does to people. So our data showed a really strong link between experiencing harm and high psychological distress. So many partners, current and ex, and about 30% of the family members showed clinically significant levels of distress. I was actually surprised at how many affected others reported this and how high it was. This chart shows the average psychological distress scores for current and ex-partners is over 11, 11.1, 11.7. And average scores to family members will cut close to 10, I think it's 9.7. And scores of 10 or higher on this measure are considered clinically significant and in need of some sort of support or treatment. Another one of the more interesting findings was the impact on role emotion. So role emotion is a formal measure of how much your emotional state prevents you from doing your job or carrying out sort of your daily tasks or responsibilities. And partners and ex-partners, again, were the most affected. Sort of shows that the distress they're experiencing has sort of real world consequences on their ability to function their job or just manage their day-to-day responsibilities. For the next part of the study, we wanted to look at how some individual factors, so in how people cope or what support they have, and how that impacts the experience of gambling related harm. We based this work on the stress strain coping support model developed for addictions, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, as it forms the basis of the 5-step model of treatment. It's quite a simple framework. So the external life circumstances that cause difficulty, such as a loved one's problem with addiction or gambling problems or serious illness, can be the stressor. And the negative physical and psychological effects that result from this stress, such as anxiety, depression, illness, are the strain. So in our study, that was operationalised as the sort of harm and distress the affected others feel. And the model proposes two key things: the person's coping style and their level of social support can act as a filter, either amplifying the strain or reducing it. Social support are the resources that are available to the individual, such as emotional support, information, and practical professional help. And coping strategies are the various strategies people use to manage their stress and strain, which might be helpful, like seeking information, or not so helpful. We used a brief version of the coping questionnaire, which is part of the short questionnaire for family members. This tool identifies different ways people respond to the stress of being close to someone with a gambling problem. The previous research had identified some specific types of coping as being associated with greater anxiety and distress. For example, confronting behaviours that can lead to further arguments and distress. And there are other coping styles which previous research had identified as adaptive, such as withdrawing and getting on with your own life, and that have been linked to more positive outcomes. So the coping styles we looked at were engaged emotional coping, which includes actions like arguing, getting a bit moody, expressing frustration, which is sort of quite normal emotional reactions to a really stressful situation. Then there's engaged assertive coping, which involves trying to sort of more control or monitor the person's behaviour, like confronting them, checking up on their gambling. Again, quite a common reaction. And finally, tolerant and active coping, which includes sort of covering up for the person, making excuses for them, lending them money, to try to help them avoid the negative consequences. Of the three, we found that tolerant and active, which was sort of covering up, lending money, and engaged emotional, which is the arguing, getting moody, were most strongly associated with distress. But these behaviours really often are used together. You aren't just using one type. So based on the previous studies, and to give us a bit more statistical power, we grouped these three types of coping behaviours into what we refer to as maladaptive coping. And we just use this term, which I don't love, to be honest, but basically to refer to coping behaviours that, according to the evidence, appeared to be associated with greater harm and distress. An interesting thing about these behaviours are how common they were. So over 90% of participants in our study reported using at least one of these behaviours. So which is, that's almost the same proportion of people who reported being harmed. Our analysis did confirm that greater use of those maladaptive coping styles was strongly associated with higher levels of psychological distress. So the more they were used, the greater the amount of distress experienced. And we saw a significant interaction between the severity of the gambling problem and maladaptive coping behaviours in relation to psychological distress, indicating that the relationship between the two, so the severity of the problem and distress, might be more pronounced when there is greater use of maladaptive coping behaviours or these coping behaviours. And the results were similar with harm. The more maladaptive coping behaviours were used, the higher the harm experience, although no interaction effect was found for harm. Although it does obviously bring up a really important question about causality, which I can't answer. So does using coping behaviours, or does using these coping behaviours cause more harm and distress, or as the gambling problem gets more severe, does experiencing greater harm and distress cause people to use these coping styles more often, perhaps out of sort of sheer desperation? So because our study was cross-sectional, we couldn't determine the direction. I think it's likely that the relationship is sort of bidirectional, so a kind of vicious cycle where, I guess, experiencing severe harm might trigger these coping responses, which in turn can increase conflict and then lead to more harm, and it just, goes on. But I don't know. It doesn't mean these behaviours necessarily sort of wrong. It just means they mightn't be effective in reducing sort of the harm and distress that they're experiencing. And just may unintentionally be making things sort of worse. As I mentioned before, these behaviours are really, really common. They were used by over 90% of participants in our study. I guess this is why it's sort of so important that affected others are supported, not just to understand the gambling problem and to effectively support the person with those issues, but also to explore their own coping strategies that they can use to sort of protect their own well-being. I guess without support, it's natural for us to fall back on the only tools we have, even if they're not ultimately the most helpful tools. The other form of coping is withdrawal coping, where the affected other distances themselves from the person who gambles and tries to sort of gain interdependence by sort of prioritising their own activities and prioritising themselves. Again, we found this to be quite common, over 90% of participants using at least one of those sort of withdrawal coping behaviours, which is quite different. So based on previous research, we expected these behaviours to be protective and not that common under some extreme circumstances. So expected it to be protective and to see it associated with sort of less harm and distress. However, I find it's a lot more complex than that. And in our initial analysis, we found the opposite to what we're expecting. So withdrawal coping was positively correlated with experiencing sort of more harm and more distress. And then when we put everything into our sort of final statistical model, which is a comprehensive model, so controlling for the severity of the other person's gambling problem and their closeness, the other coping styles and social support, the effect of withdrawal coping disappeared entirely. So it was like no longer a significant predictor of either harm or distress, either positively or negatively. Which sort of tells us that getting on with your own thing isn't necessarily this magic bullet. Our findings are complicated, but it suggests possibly a few things. So it's likely that people only resort to withdrawal as sort of a last-ditch effort when harm and distress are already quite high, and that would explain the initial sort of positive correlation. It also highlights how difficult this might be to implement. So the ability to withdraw is deeply tangled up with this practical entanglement that we discussed earlier. And it might be incredibly difficult and indeed distressing in itself to sort of withdraw from someone when you share finances and a home and parenting responsibilities, all those things. So overall, it just sort of shows that withdrawal isn't necessarily a simple fix. Its effectiveness is really sort of complex and likely depends on so many other factors, especially whether a person is practically able to separate, parts of their life from the other person. So, a more positive thing, the most positive finding from this part of the study relates to social support. So we measured social support as a perception of support from their significant other, family or friends. So it was about informal rather than professional support. And we found a clear, significant and protective effect. The more social support a person felt they had from their friends and family, the lower their levels of harm and psychological distress were. And this is controlling for like the severity of the gambling problem and all those other things. This strongly supports the idea that social support acts as this sort of buffer or shield against the stress of another person's gambling. The challenge, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is that affected others often become isolated and disconnected from these very networks. So it appears that like the gambling problem appears to sort of take away the key factor that would aid in helping to reduce the harm and distress experienced by the affected other. So what does this all mean? I guess when we put everything together, there's a clear profile of risk emerges. So affected others who suffer the most are those who are exposed to more severe gambling problems, who are partners, either current or ex-partners, or those more closely entangled through finances or other practical responsibilities, who react with coping styles that are ultimately not that helpful, and who lack a strong support network to fall back on. And what's it mean? I guess it's clear that gambling harm doesn't just affect the person who gambles, it radiates sort of outwards, often in quite serious ways. And we found that affected others, especially partners, current and ex, and those who are practically entangled, experience really high levels of distress. And the distress, this distress is sort of clinically significant for many of the people, especially the partners, and it directly impacts a person's ability to function day to day at work. And this shows sort of a direct pathway from sort of the gambling harm through psychological distress to this sort of functional impairment of day to day. And of course, all of this likely exacerbates existing physical and psychological issues, which, as discussed earlier, are often common in affected others, even before gambling becomes a problem in their life. And this connects in with another study I did a while ago, another large population representative study, which found that people with a gambling problem in the household were 3 times more likely than people who don't to have other stresses in their lives at that time, other sort of not great stresses, and they were 8 times more likely to have other addictions like drugs or alcohol within the household, and 8 times more likely to be associated with criminal issues in the household, so trouble with police, violence, abuse, all that sort of stuff. So I guess the message there is that affected others have a lot going on, a lot more than just the gambling problem. So I guess what can be done about this? First, we need to treat the distress directly. So they're meeting clinical thresholds for psychological distress, which needs to be addressed, and not just sort of with ex-partners, not just assumed to improve if the gambling stops or they leave the situation. Second, feel like there's a need to shift the focus from sort of emotional detachment or withdrawal to sort of more practical boundaries. So it's not just about how much someone cares for them, it's whether they're financially and functionally entangled, because that's where the harm comes from. Even ex-partners having left the relationship are experiencing, or through reporting that they're experiencing harm. So we need to relook at coping. I guess many affectors are doing their best, but the strategies they're using might be making it worse. So we need to give them sort of new tools or ways to protect themselves without increasing sort of this conflict and distress. And finally, we need to actively sort of rebuild that social support, which might mean helping people reconnect with family and friends or create peer support places. And we have to sort of find a way to make all this help accessible. So most affected others don't seek professional support. They might go online for support, or sometimes call helplines. So it means we have to make sure all these messages and support are accessible to them in these places, so online or on helplines. And I think that is it. Yeah, I want to just thank all the people who participated in my study and my funders, the New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling, and the rest of my wonderful team. And thank you for time and attention. And now I'll have a drink and cough.
Thank you so much, Cathie, and you've done so well, because it's awful when your voice is barely hanging in there. You've done so well. So just any questions either in the chat or raising hands? We have a question from Steph. What would you like to say, Steph?
Hi, Cathie. Thanks so much for that. And it's lovely to see you again. We met earlier this year and that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Just two things for me. One was I'm going to be writing a paper about sisters. I've noticed over the last couple of years that sisters and the gambling harms that they experience is really underestimated. It's quite complex, particularly if there's two male siblings and one of them is the gambler. So it'd be really good to us, to have a look at that. The other thing is withdrawing. Oh my goodness, I mean, that's what I did with my husband in the end. It's the only way you can cope. But just to say that part of the work that I do with my clients is where it's okay to withdraw. So we have bubble work where it's okay to take some time out, particularly with mothers that have got this fear of suicide and have been living on the edge for so long. I actually endorse withdrawal. So I might say to them, it's okay to switch off. It's okay to go to bed early some nights and think, whatever will be, will be. So I think you're quite right. It was interesting that came up in your research paper. But again, it's about teaching ourselves as affected others how to have a healthy withdrawal and recognise that sometimes we need that. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Steph and
Thank
Jim,
you.
welcome.
Yeah.
Actually, Cathie,
Right.
did you want to respond, to anything that Steph just mentioned then? Just
No, all right. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
So thanks, Steph. Yeah.
Thanks, Steph. Jim.
Yes, Cathie, thank you so much for a brilliant bit of work and beautifully presented. I might say really, really clearly, clearly presented. It's lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, lots of things I could comment on and lots of interest there. I mean, I particularly liked your development of the closeness scale. I've not seen anything quite like that before, and I thought you found some really helpful results with that. But I thought my question, I think, is about social support, and again, you found that to be really important. But I wonder whether it's not just that people don't get social support, but that actually family members often find that what could have been positive social support is actually cut off. So one of the questions that some of the British researchers recently asked is, have you felt embarrassment, guilt, or shame? So the idea of actually feeling stigmatized, actually positively stigmatized. It's not just that normal social support is cut off, or you're not getting it, but there's actually something very negative being put in its place, that people don't feel they're listened to, they don't feel being a family member is understood, and worse, that they actually feel blamed or feel shame themselves. I wonder if you've got any comments on that.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think that's got a lot to do with it. It's that, they're embarrassed, so they, I guess, withdraw then slowly from their friends or their normal social network that sort of might provide support. There's probably people here with lived experience who know that more, but yeah, I do get that feeling that shame and stigma and all those things are really, really important factors.
Should.
Cathie, thank you so much. Really brilliant overheads, I thought. You laid things out in your overheads so clearly. Fantastic. I'm going to nick some of them, I think, when we have them online. One of the things I just wanted to comment on was how important replication in science is. And it was really nice to see you using the stress strain information coping support model, because I think that a lot of work that Jim and I and others have done on this, it's been the group of people who developed the theory who then tests the theory. And what we know about replication in science is that it's really important to have people who are unrelated to the people who develop the theory to actually do work on it. And what was really exciting is that in the main, leaving the coping bit aside, you use different measures to the measures that we have used. And yet you've come up with a lot of stuff which underpins and helps with the replication of the model. So I just think that's a really exciting thing in terms of science, and obviously very nice that other researchers can find similar things that we have found which led us to develop our model in the first place. So that's brilliant. I just a couple of questions. One of them is about well, a comment really about withdrawal coping. And I think you're right to say that if anyone had thought withdrawal coping might be a quick fix, your results demonstrate that it's not a quick fix. I think, as you say, it's impossible to look at the causal relationships in that data that you've got. But obviously, it's very likely that by the time somebody comes to think about withdrawal coping, it's not their first choice. And so normally the level of distress and level of damage is really pretty intense at the time that they then think, gosh, I need to take some time off. I need to back away from this. And it's not surprising that that would be correlated with quite high levels, therefore, of distress, because it's a method of last resort. And although it might lead to a reduction in strain, it's probably not going to lead to a major reduction in strain because the worry and concern is still there about what's happening when they're withdrawing and so on. And it's very interesting. And I think one of the most interesting bits about your findings was about the ex-partners. And yes, it's quite clear that becoming an ex-partner doesn't reduce the issues at all. I mean, ex-partners in that sense become very similar to parents, which is it's something that you can't quite give up. You can't turn your back on it. And I think your term of financial and functional entanglement is, I think, a really powerful one. I really like that as a way of explaining why it's so difficult for people to move out. I suppose my question to you relates, you said this was based around a lot of your PhD work and that your PhD obviously finished some time ago. What are you doing now which is developing any of these ideas or sorts? What's your current research program, and are there anything related to this which you can tell us anything about?
Yes, well, I've spent the last year, I guess, doing social and economic costings of gambling harm, which is a slightly different area. But I'm just hopefully close to getting a grant to look at legacy harm. That's sort of something that I'm always interested in. So the New South Wales study, the prevalence survey had around, I think it was like 7 or 8% of people saying that they were still experiencing harm from someone else's gambling from over 12 months ago. So the gambling problem had sort of resolved and they were still experiencing these legacy harms, which is, it struck me as a really high proportion. But it was a single item question. So it was just are you experiencing these harms? So I'm trying to get some money to sort of look further into that and sort of understand what sort of harms are they still experiencing? Are they still paying off debts, or are they still, what is it that is lasting and how long is it lasting? Which I guess, it's sort of part of the ex-partners thing ties into that. It's just, even once the gambling problem is resolved, it doesn't necessarily mean that the harm is resolved, or even if you completely remove yourself from that person, it's not over.
I think when you do look, I think that's going to be really interesting and actually very important to understand something about how long-lasting harm can be, even if the problem has resolved. I think one of the subsets that you will come across is another area of interest that we've talked about in AFINet webinars, which is people who've been bereaved because of a gambling problem and a drug or an alcohol one. So some of these people who are saying, yes, they're still experiencing harm more than 12 months after the resolution may actually be death. And it will be very interesting to look at that subset as well, because what we know is that the issues about grief and bereavement carry on for a very long time. Once somebody has died, particularly if it's a death through suicide, even though in one sense the problem has resolved, obviously in other senses the problem hasn't resolved at all. So I think that whole area of legacy harm is something which will be tremendously interesting. Well, I'd like to welcome you back to another webinar in a couple of years' time to tell us about the results of that. Fingers crossed you get the grant.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. I think we've actually hit 9 o'clock. There are some interesting comments. One from Lynn: for social support to be effective, does it imply that the affected others actively open up about what is going on about the gambling? Because often in family systems, we can see a closed system that doesn't talk about what is going on inside the house. And that speaks to the dilemma, I suppose. I think more of a question answer within that one statement. And also another comment, interesting to hear the emotional closeness is not so high a predictor of distress level as financial responsibilities. Hopefully spouses would also have some emotional closeness as well. And I had some questions, but we've run out of time, unfortunately. But Cathie, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. And the great thing is that
Thank you for having me.
Oh, that's been great. And the special thing is that this webinar will go on the website a little bit later in the week, so it can be revisited, but excellent slides and great discussion. So thank you so much. And that almost brings us to the end, but just to let you all know that our next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 14th of January, 2026, UK time, 2 o'clock, 9 a.m. USA, Canada, 3 o'clock Western Europe, 4 o'clock Finland, 7:30 India, in Australia, 1 a.m. So we'll be up with our hot chocolates. And the presentation will be coming from the UK, where Eugene Farrar and Gary Shepherd from York Street, St John University, School of Education, Language and Psychology in York, will be presenting a presentation, How Does Involvement in Campaigning Impact Close Relatives Bereaved by Gambling-Related Suicide, which, just as Richard was touching on there, really important topic to explore. So that's coming up in January. So everyone have a safe Christmas break and joyful New Year. And to Cathie, thank you so much for attending, and see you all in 2 months' time for the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Cathie. Thank you, Rob.